Hello, hello. Welcome back to the P2P Soap Box. I'm your host and P2P BFF, Marcie Maxwell. It is hard to believe we are already at the end of our 5th season of the P2P Soap Box. After this episode, we'll be taking a break while we prep for P2P Forum 26 in Baltimore this February. But don't worry, we will be back in the spring with all new episodes. If you've been in the peer-to-peer space for any length of time, you've probably felt the squeeze. Our teams are being asked to do more with less, expectations keep rising, and the pace rarely slows. But here's the thing. Some organizations are stepping back and rethinking what capacity building can look like when you center people, clarity, and collaboration, and the results are really powerful. Today, I'm joined by someone who lives this work with so much heart, Diana Perrault, Director of Peer-to-Peer Fundraising at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. MMRF is the largest nonprofit in the world solely focused on accelerating a cure for every single multiple myeloma patient. And Diana's leadership plays a key role in bringing that mission to life through community-driven fundraising. Diana has rebuilt her team infrastructure, expanded staff capacity, and created an environment where her fundraisers feel supported and energized. In our conversation, she shares the early signs that a team needs a reset, how leaders can genuinely understand the load their staff are carrying, and why strong one-on-one conversations can uncover the real barriers that are holding people back. We'll also talk about advocating for resources with confidence, choosing tools that actually help, and building trust across your remote teams. There's a lot of wisdom here, so let's jump right into my conversation with MMRF's Diana Perrault. Diana, welcome to the P2P Soap Box.
Hello, so glad to be here.
So happy to have you. So, as I always like to start, tell us a little bit about your personal journey, your professional journey that led you to your role at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation.
Sure. So you know how you're growing up and you envision your job. I will absolutely say this was not on my radar, but I knew that I wanted to be in a very service-oriented role. And I wanted to be creative. I wanted to be able to write. I wanted to be able to talk to people. And I didn't know what that was. But I will be honest, my dad was really questioning my career choices because, you know, we have a Filipino heritage. And so in our culture, you know, you're typically a doctor or an accountant or a teacher. And he's like, you know, I think you do really well in public administration. So my background's actually in organizational communications. And I also have a BS in public administration. And I blended the two together. But I actually started out really early on in radio, believe it or not. Transitioned into television a couple years later, and a good friend of mine, knowing that I was very, community focused, asked me if I wanted to explore the nonprofit space as a fundraiser. And so at the time, I was fundraising for the ALS Association because I have a familial connection to the cause. I jumped at the opportunity, was there for 5 years as a walk coordinator, and then eventually, overseeing Florida's development opportunities, moved over to the Bleeding Disorders Foundation, and then ended up at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. So spent some time there doing marketing, and now I'm at the MMRF. So very exciting stuff.
I love that. And I think about what you wanted to be when you grew up. I always used to say I wanted to be a pediatrician because I loved kids and I always wanted to help people. And then I really got into the science classes and I thought, I do not want to do this is not the kind of work that I want to do. I don't want to do science all day long. And so then when I first got my first job out of college, raising money for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, I remember thinking, this is my way of helping sick kids and using the skills that I actually enjoy instead of having to, take every biology anatomy class that never entertained me. So I love it. So for listeners who might not be familiar with MMRF, can you just give us a quick overview of your peer-to-peer portfolio and what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So we are a small but very mighty peer-to-peer program. We have three large, revenue arms that go with our peer-to-peer program. So we have our traditional MMRF walk. We have 16 events across the U.S., including a national virtual walk, as well as a very healthy endurance program. So hike, cycling, and traditional marathon participation. And we also have a create your own fundraising arm. So that would be your traditional DIY, as some organizations would refer to it. So we have all in all about $4.2 million just in peer-to-peer revenue, and it's growing, which is really exciting.
That is really exciting. But what's also exciting is, at a time when so many fundraising leaders are being asked to do more with less, you've actually had the opportunity to grow your team. So what were the first signs, that your team needed to revitalize, rebuild its structure, and kind of rethink the roles you had in place?
Well, I think what ended up happening, for me at least, is I was brought in and really it was very clear from the beginning that the organization knew that there was so much potential for peer-to-peer. They just couldn't harness it properly. And one of the first things I did was truly just assess where they were. I spent probably the first 2 months digging into every piece of data I could. And so I was consistently, assessing the programs. Where were we? Wanting to understand every single event. How much is it raising? How many fundraisers are there, that are coming back or are in the portfolio? What does retention look like? Where is our staff located? And then I wanted to think about big sky. If resourcing wasn't an issue, right? If money wasn't an issue, if someone was to say yes, what would this program look like? And that's where the ideas started kind of bubbling up. Because, I think all of us in peer-to-peer, we have this like P2P gut where you already see what you need to do and you have this idea, but you just kind of need to understand, how do you activate your markets? Like how do you get in there and how do you make it work? So I did a lot of that. And then I finally looked at, the data and the participant behavior to understand better what that was telling us and the story that was being really, illuminated through their participant, fundraising behaviors. And then finally, I really just spoke with the fundraising team that was in place at the time. I wanted to find out, were they stretched thin? Do they have the resources that they needed to be successful? Did they feel like they were having really meaningful conversations out in the field? And honestly, looking at that now, I was also assessing, do we have the right skills and the right staff in place?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think you can have the best strategy in the world, but if you don't have the right quality of people and the right quantity of people to actually pull it off successfully, your strategy only goes so far. One of the things I've noticed kind of in the peer-to-peer space is, we often, yes, we try to do more with less, but we also, are constantly trying to, squeeze more juice out of every single, staff member we have, to the point where there can be burnout. I think a lot in the nonprofit space. So how do you assess kind of navigating, teams being burnout and building a structure in place to avoid that burnout, if at all possible?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I think, for anyone that's been in the peer-to-peer space for a while, you can kind of tell pretty easily if a fundraising team is struggling. You kind of see the signs, the writing's on the wall. You feel that the fundraising isn't where it needs to be. The team may not be as engaged as you'd like them to be. You feel like the attitudes are screaming, I'm burnt out. You've seen it because potentially you've been there too, and so I think that lack of excitement and engagement really tells that larger story. And you kind of also take back this, you take this step back and you think to yourself, where are the ideas? What are we doing? And you kind of realize they may be burnt out or we may not be staffed adequately because the ideas aren't happening. There is no time to ideate. And you are seeing that burnout really roll itself out in the fundraising itself. So I think for us here, there was a lot of confidence in the team that was there in place, but there were obvious signs that it was time to make investments to make sure that the team was being optimized in the right way.
I often think about, when I think about staffing, a time in my career when the organization brought in someone from the outside, a completely different industry, to kind of take a look at our staffing. And they had more come from a sales background, a large sales background, and really so much of what we do in peer-to-peer fundraising. We don't like to call ourselves salespeople, but we are. And they looked at our staffing and they just said, everybody is over capacity. And really, you should be staffing to 80% capacity. And that was kind of shocking. Like nobody should be maxed out, because to your point, it doesn't give them time to ideate. It doesn't get them time to do anything new. It also doesn't allow for, frankly, maternity leaves or FMLA or vacations without creating more burnout for the rest of the team. I remember these gentlemen looked at it and they said, your staff are all in this, mid 20s to early 30s. They love their jobs. They're good at their jobs, but they're getting married and maybe they're wanting to have kids. And then there's always somebody going out on maternity leave or paternity leave. And that then creates a challenge for the whole rest of your team to pick up the slack while that person is out. So if you're always staffed to 100% capacity, you have no wiggle room. And so they've said sometimes that is just adding one more person. And yes, it's stressful, or yes, it's budget that you have to consider, but you're actually better staffed to be, one person over than exactly at where you need to be.
I've been in peer-to-peer for almost 15 years. Scary to think about it, but still so amazing, when I think about that. But I obviously have never met a fundraising staff person who's felt bored, right? Like, no one's ever bored. Anything.
It might have a slow week in the middle of the summer, and that's
right.
About
maybe
it.
Right. Like,
maybe.
Then it's usually that 2-week window in between one event slowly tapering down and ending, right, and then the next one standing up. So, and I think to your point, one of the issues that I feel happens in this space is that you have incredible leaders at organizations who really want to be in tune with peer-to-peer, and they know about it and they care about it, but they probably don't know as deep about peer-to-peer as they should. And so it's not ignorance, really. It's more of a lack of knowledge of what goes into peer-to-peer fundraising. And one of the things I always say is, peer-to-peer gets this rep, right? Like, they're the party planners. They just, they put a tent, they're hosting a party is kind of the vibe sometimes that peer-to-peer faces. I mean, it's reality. But truthfully, it's our roles as leader to illuminate for senior staff what goes into the day, because they may not know of a fundraiser. And I always look at it also too as you have your development team, your peer-to-peer is exactly the same. They're doing very, very similar work. And peer-to-peer, I think too, because we are such doers and you're out in the field, you're making the calls, you're organizing logistics possibly. You're also taking a look at data and you do it all. It's hard because a lot of staff that do peer-to-peer, they do it so well that it looks effortless.
Yes. Agreed.
And then, right. And then when it does come to times where you need vacancy support, you don't have it because everybody is already at capacity. So I actually love that idea of, the model of vacancy support. It's something I personally think is wonderful to have because, again, everyone I've had, I feel like is always at 100, 110, 130%. And it's all about being really smart about how we staff and how we are prepared for those days where there may be a very unique scenario.
And I also think we talk about 100%, 80%, 120%. It's also thinking 100% of what? Right? I know I've seen, organizations in the past where they staff to a dollar amount and they say, once every staff person is raising an average of $1 million, I use that for easy math, then we can add a new staff person. But running a $1 million walk and running a $1 million, gala is actually two different levels of work. It's both hard, both challenging, but the volume of relationships are really different for those different kinds of events. And there was a point where these same gentlemen that came in from the sales organization, and they looked at it and they said, why aren't you staffing to volume of relationships the way, say, the major gifts teams do? They look at it as, how many people are in your portfolio and not just how many dollars are coming in. And so staffing to people, staffing to support as opposed to the outcome, I think is another way of looking at it. And sometimes that's where you actually see how maybe wrong sized your staff actually is when you say, we would never ask a major gift officer to manage, again, say 500 names in a portfolio, yet we're asking a walk manager to manage 1,500 relationships for their event, they're never going to be as successful.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought that example, because when I came to the MMRF and started doing this data assessment and understanding where we were, we only had 2 staff on walk for 15 events. And granted, they were smaller, but the portfolio size, when I broke it down of the number of participants, we would have staff that were possibly overseeing 2,500 relationships at a time. Granted, you have your non-engaged, right? So it probably wasn't that many. But I always have said too, staff for where you want to be, right? Because we may be at capacity, but also where do you want to be 12 to 18 months from now? And do we have this current staff in place and the infrastructure and tools we need to meet that moment down the line where you're seeing those considerable increases in revenue and engagement and participation?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So when you are working with your teams, what is your thoughts on how leaders can really make the most of, their one-on-one conversations with their team members to really uncover some of those pain points and then ultimately remove the barriers in place?
I say this often, but I always wear this badge of pride that screams, I've been in your shoes. I've actually done the work. And so many of us in peer-to-peer have been incredibly blessed to be able to have grown within peer-to-peer. I always say, I've had such the benefit of incredible peer-to-peer mentors and directors ahead of me pour into me, and I've had the best modeling. There were times where, of course, we've had that boss that everyone has in their mind, right? That wasn't the best fit, but I've had great peer-to-peer mentors ahead of me who have just shown what this can look like when you're a successful team, when you're poured into, and when you have the right coaching. And so I think it's really about leaders shining the light on what the work is, right? Understanding that C-suite may not know what a day in the life of a frontline fundraising staff looks like, and being your staff's advocate, your team's advocate. One of our core values at the MMRF is to build trust. And so my first 6 months here till this day, I work really hard to build trust with the team that I oversee and within my team. I feel like the most candid conversations come from when your team knows that they can come to you and just talk and have that unfiltered lens that tells you all that you need to know about how they're feeling, how they're doing out in the field. But it's also our job as fundraising leaders to ask those questions and ask the right questions. That sometimes you have different staff, different expertise, different years in the seat that they may not be comfortable advocating for themselves, right? So what does that look like? What do they need? What do they wish they had in terms of resources and support? And I think that's kind of where, when you have these one-on-one conversations, you're going to learn so much more about your staff and be able to build that trust and remove those barriers to communication, to the cross-functional pain points that you sometimes find. I think communication and building trust, but also letting them know you understand their work is so valuable in this space.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I've often, from a one-on-one standpoint, taken the approach of, yes, what do you want to update me on? What are your questions for me? But also, what barriers in the next week do you need me to help you remove? Or do you need me to advocate for you on? And really making that a known part of a one-on-one agenda, that's what's part of these meetings. These aren't just status updates for you to just, repeat what you could put in an email. It's an actual conversation of how can I help you in the next week as your manager, your boss, to be more successful. I think is such a critical conversation point.
And, we leverage an agenda, but in very different ways. We were speaking about using Asana as one of our project management tools before we hopped on the podcast. And what I will say is Asana, or any project management tool, really offers great ways to use that and reimagine how you use it in real time. So what we like to do here, and it works differently for each person because everyone has different needs, right? But it's what questions do you have? What are your priorities that you're working on? What do you see are your priorities? But also, what are our organizational and fundraising priorities in this moment? Because we know it changes. So it's hitting upon that, but also just spending such a big time, allocated and dedicated to just how are you? How is life outside of this work? Because the hours are so long, the work is so intense, and how meaningful is it when your leader asks you, how are you doing? What's going on? We don't take ourselves so seriously. And honestly, I'll say our team has just seen this turnaround in communication. And it's really just because on a very human level, we want to connect and be there and be supportive.
I love that. I also had a boss, and this was when we were in offices, but I still think it's a good idea. We'd have our weekly one-on-ones where we'd go through, the priorities for the week, but we would also have a quarterly one-on-one. And the thought behind that is not to talk about projects. That is to talk about career trajectory. That's to give feedback. The idea of, she would always say, I never want you to see something on your performance review that was a surprise. I'd rather us be talking about it. I'd rather us be looking at what skills are you looking to develop. And that it's hard to necessarily talk about that every week, especially when you're in the weeds of right before an event. So we always knew we had this dedicated time once a quarter. When we were in an office, we would leave, go get coffee. We would sit, and it was more of a time to discuss a career path as opposed to just the day to day. And I look back, and that was something I carried, with my own teams after I worked for her, because I thought it was such a valuable kind of way to stay on top of what that staff person was really looking for in their career plan.
That's so true. And also, carving out the time to just ask staff too, what excites you about your job? And we often lose sight of that because we spoke about earlier, right? You're doing so many things, all the things, the data, the logistics, worrying about tents, possibly t-shirts, high touch teams, team size. Are they fundraising? Has someone earned the shirt? There's just so much going on that I think when you peel it back and you ask staff, what do you love about your work? You also get these amazing moments of really calling out their own career pathing. And they're telling you what they like. And I think it's really, because peer-to-peer, and I'm sure this is a whole other topic, right? But the turnover, it exists because we don't have a path in peer-to-peer often for staff, right? You usually have one director, you have all your staff. Where do they go? But I think now you're seeing this, and in more recent years, I think, you see a lot more of this is with the skill sets we have on the team. How do we flex? How do we make sure that we can highlight some of those really, really important skills and find ways to keep people engaged and keep staff moving and growing? The goal I have is why do peer-to-peer staff turnover so quick? Seriously. That's because there's no career path.
I don't disagree. And I also think we often don't do so for so many of our peer-to-peer staff, it might be their first job, right? Or one of their first jobs. And so I think it becomes, well, that's what I did when I was new in my career. I want to advance and want to do more. I don't think we ever really explain or, point out all the skills you're learning in peer-to-peer that could take you down, a dozen different paths in development. You're learning to manage a committee that could set you up to manage a board one day as an executive director. You're learning to sell sponsorship that could take you down, a corporate sales side of the house. You're building relationships that could one day lead you into major gifts. Or you are an event person. Maybe that is truly what you love. And you realize that, and there's other pathways, whether with this nonprofit, another nonprofit, or even outside the nonprofit space, we don't kind of point out you're learning all of these skills. This is kind of the point where you get the best training ground. I was just interviewing for a role on my team, and it was a project management role. And it was a former colleague of mine from 20 years ago. We were doing events together. Ultimately, didn't end up being quite the right fit to join the team. But she's like, this is how I got my start in project management, was doing events. And now I do all kinds of different projects and manage, from what I learned, when I was 22, 23, 24 as a fundraising event staff person that now have led me down this career path. And I don't think we often point that out to people of what they're learning.
We really don't. And, I spent 2 years at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation overseeing their peer-to-peer marketing. And that was a very intentional step in my career because I felt that I wanted to better understand how great marketing can influence recruitment and activation and retention. And, I think right? There's always a push-pull between fundraising and marketing. It's always there. It's every organization I've been at, it's just, it exists. But I wanted to understand why. And it was so fascinating being in that role and understanding the priorities of marketing teams and the priorities of peer-to-peer fundraising teams and blending it and really getting out of my comfort zone and learning so many skills that I had from fundraising and marketing, right? Because so many fundraising staff are now in Canva. They're making their own documents and resources and tools and social media graphics. And it was just a really great lesson. And I encourage anybody, honestly, that's interested. Those roles are great because it's also how people are communicating now. Is how are we meeting our donors and our participants where they are? But, I'm bringing this back to say, yes, there are paths for peer-to-peer staff. Like, talk to your leaders, talk to your managers, have those conversations, and a good leader will listen and help you get on that path and pinpoint the pocket of opportunity that's right for you.
I agree. I often have people that come to me and say, I'm looking to restructure my team. What's the best way to do it? And while I appreciate that they think I am, all knowing, right, I guess, or they want my perspective, usually what I say is like, there is not a one size fits all answer to infrastructure. There's lots of different ways to be successful with your structure. But how do you think organizations can kind of identify, the right tools, system, structure that's going to align with their team's goals?
I think to your point, it is so different depending on the organization, the size of the organization, the budget. But either way, you have to go in with a couple of easy steps. I really am such a proponent of being confident. You have to remember, as peer-to-peer staff, you are the expert. You are hired for a reason. You know your stuff. And it's a confidence booster for us as staff, but also externally to C-suite, you have to be confident in your area of expertise. So that's number one. You can't go in with your shoulders down, acting as if you've never been here before, because chances are you've been in it for a while, right? So you're going to go in confident. You need to be prepared to make that case, and you have to amplify what your data is saying. You have to do your research, because a very good friend of mine, Allison Lardner, ALS Association, she used to always say, the numbers don't lie. And I agree, right? The numbers don't lie. When I first came to the MMRF, we were flat year over year for 3 years for peer-to-peer. Not terrible, right? But to me, I would look at that and I'd say, something's broken, right? Like, something's not working. If you're flat and your average fundraising isn't ticking up slowly year over year, something's wrong and there needs to be an adjustment. So what is that? You just got to look at your data and understand what it's telling you, but also go into that meeting when you need to advocate for the resources and infrastructure that you need and just say it, right? It's that simple. And I think too, women, depending on, their situations, going into, your CEO's office and having these conversations and that confidence, it depends on what your personal experience has been. But you have the expertise and the confidence to go in there and just say it and advocate for the needs of your team and for what you see to be the right solution. So just say it. I am so grateful because our CEO, Mike, here at the MMRF, he is very forward thinking and he's all about what do we need to do just to do the work well, and I went in and we had a really candid conversation. I had my slide deck. Granted, it was like 50 slides, of course. but the data was there, but you have to paint the picture because a lot of times your C-suite's not going to know. They're not going to know. So you have to be the one to paint that picture, but also be prepared to hear a no, right? And if that's the case, it's up to you to say on behalf of your team, if it's a no right now, I want to keep these lines of communication open so that we can revisit this when the time is right. Because I guarantee you, they're listening and it might not be a yes right now. Perhaps the budget is cost prohibitive. Maybe you can't do it, but they certainly hear you.
Yep. I can remember a time making the case for staff to your point of, the leadership, sometimes they only know kind of, they know inch deep, right? Instead of all the way down the way we do. And that's because they're looking at everything, right? But we went into the leadership team and, kind of with this idea of, how we need to add some staff and what does that look like? And we got some data from other organizations at the time to draw some comparisons. And we said, okay, when you plotted out dedicated staff to a program revenue, it was all over the map, right? There was no clear-cut answer. But when you plotted dedicated staff to participants and volunteers, it was almost a perfect line in terms of what some other organizations were doing to staff to their events. And I remember it clicking for the leadership team, just being like, oh, okay. So we're not staffed up to support the volume that we need, which will then lead to the revenue. We're like, exactly. And so it wasn't that they were not smart, educated people. They had just never seen the data presented that way. And once they did, they were like, okay. Now they did, I think we asked at the time for 40 staff and they were like, you can have 6. And we're like, we will take it. Let's see what we can do with that. Let's test that out. But again, it was a different way of looking at the data in a way that kind of helped make our case. So I agree that, how do you use your data to make the case? And sometimes it's showing it a little bit differently.
Absolutely. And when I first came on board here, my leader, Pam Spear-Lewis, wonderful Senior Vice President of Development here at the MMRF, she and I would meet and I'd say, we have 2 staff for 15 walks. And so how we kind of bringing this back where we were earlier of where do you see yourself? Where do you see your team? Where do you see revenue in 12 to 18 to 24 months? I was like, how are we going to do this with 2 staff based out of the Northeast and we have events on the West Coast, right? And in peer-to-peer, we talk so much about getting into these communities and relationship building. But there are so many barriers from the get-go when you think about having someone, right, from one geographic area of the United States going into different markets that they're just not in the know, right? Everyone thinks about their own city or town. When I lived in I still live in Orlando, but when I was overseeing our Tampa walk, even though, when I was at the ALS Association, it was only an hour and a half away, I was not embedded in that culture. And that myself, I thought was kind of different, right? It just kind of takes somebody in those cities and markets to understand. And so leadership here was so, they were so into listening and just leaning in and hearing from me what I thought needed to be done. And so we brought in a regional staffing model. We changed the infrastructure completely of our team. So we went from 2 on walk to 4. We added an additional headcount to our endurance team. And we added a fundraising operations role to just take on all of those non-revenue generating tasks that were keeping our frontline fundraisers from doing exactly that. And so it's just really this culmination of looking at your data, again, being confident and remembering where you yourself as a frontline fundraiser once was to make those recommendations to leadership, to make changes, that are really going to benefit not only your revenue programs, but your staff.
Yep. Well, you bring up kind of one last point I wanted to talk about is, with teams being so remote. So I talked about a boss where, we would walk out of the office and go get coffee together. But as you think about, teams being remote, spread across different regions, what practical steps do you think leaders like you can take to not only build that, culture of trust, but also stay on top of, how are they managing capacity? Are they over capacity? What does that look like? How do you kind of maintain those relationships with a remote team?
Yeah, first and foremost, I really believe that it starts with your leadership, and the culture that you create and thinking about the team that you would want to sit in on. Right? You can't expect something from our team if we don't believe it and buy into it ourselves. And so, I love to set expectations. When we onboard, I have a whole onboarding deck, of course, of values. We have core values here at the MMRF, but also we have team values and they're nothing fancy, but it's really centered on, collaboration and respect, being accountable, driving out loud, and pinch hitting. We talk a lot about capacity, right? So we have to pinch hit. And there's this unspoken rule in peer-to-peer, right? That, hey, if we need you, you're probably going to have to pinch it because there's no one here. Until we can convince every leader to buy into vacancy support, chances are we are going to end up having to pinch hit wherever we need to be. But I mentioned that because with remote teams, you're just not going to get that natural synergy if you don't make time to talk to them and just be human, right? And so, it's setting those expectations, but it's also, I say to my team often, don't be your worst boss and don't be your worst colleague. It's that simple, like very, very simple principles, right? But everyone, has an immediate, perhaps even visceral reaction when you think of your worst boss or your worst teammate that you may have encountered. And so I think that gives them this line of sight to, you know what, I want to level up. And so when you start optimizing your team from kind of this very human perspective, you really are building trust, you're collaborating more, but that's all great. But again, to that degree, I would also say you have to trust your team and be available. You have to meet often. You have to keep it light, but leverage your tools too. We leverage Teams here, but I know other organizations use GChat or Slack, whatever it is, but set that tone. And if you oversee a team that also has, a little bit of a hierarchy there, require your leaders on your teams to do the same. Because that culture in peer-to-peer, we work many long hours, you work many hours together, and you have to be accountable to each other. And you're not going to be a high-performing team if you don't trust, if you don't collaborate well, and if you don't try to tackle solutions together. So I think I spent, I'd say probably the first 6 to 8 months on the job here, just rebuilding team culture. And I think it shocked the system a little bit, to be honest with you. They were like, you don't really micromanage. And it's like, well, I don't want to be my own worst boss.
No.
And exactly. I trust you. Everyone who's hired, if you're in a hiring position, chances are you've done your research, you've got the right people. And now you have to put that trust in them. And as long as we keep everyone aligned on, what our priorities are and what's important to the organization, I really believe that everything shakes out in the end, with accountability and collaboration and trust.
Yeah. I remember when I first moved from managing a team, an in-person team where, we were in cubicles right next to each other, to managing a remote team. And it did take me a little bit to adjust. But I remember thinking, with the team that was on site, I knew when they were coming in early. I knew when they were on the phone all day. And so therefore, maybe they were running late on something. I knew when they stayed late. I was able to keep such an actual eye on their capacity. And so then when I switched to a remote space, I was like, I had to have that conversation with the team to say, this isn't about micromanaging. I don't have eyes on you to know when you're over where you need to be. And so I need you have to tell me. You have to tell me when you're putting in 3 extra hours a day or when you need a break, because I can't physically see it and tell you, you know what, why don't you come in late tomorrow? Or why don't you push that deadline to Tuesday instead of Friday because you've clearly been in meetings all day, every day, And so I think it's a practical conversation. But I think when you explain why I need you to tell me those things, people are like, oh, okay. It's not just she wants to know what I'm doing all day, every day, but I want to know because I can't see it. And I can't tell if you're over your head or beyond stressed if you're not telling me. And I don't see it. So I think that's a nuance there as well.
Oh, absolutely. And time zone, right? I mean, we have a few staff members that are on the West Coast. And I always joke, I need the stockbroker clocks all over the place, just trying to keep an eye on what time it is for them. But I think it's also understanding where they are in their day and asking the right questions. And I think really good leaders will make an effort, to your point, to ask them and require them to tell you where they're at and how they're feeling. Peer-to-peer is interesting because, if you oversee 1 or 2 events in a single season, you're busy. And then if you turn it around and have to do the same the following season, whether it's spring or fall, you're extra busy. It's evergreen. And the hours are very long. I mean, the hours are so long, and taking care of remote staff can look differently. But, one of the things we try to do, we have a team call. We don't do it monthly, to be honest with you. We do it every 3 weeks because I feel like a month is kind of a long time, So we have, weekly stand-ups for each of our sub-teams, right? So endurance will have one, walk will have one, create your own / DIY will have one. But we get together as a large team every 3 weeks. And I'll be honest, we play Kahoot. We do a virtual trivia. I never realized it is so funny. I never realized how well versed the team I oversee is in Taylor Swift or animals.
I need to join your meetings.
Animals. Yeah, there's a Taylor Swiftie person. There is someone that just loves animals and another person that just knows random fun facts. And it's just a nice way to connect and kind of remember that the work is hard, the work is busy, but you're literally in it together. You understand what each other's going through. And I think making that time is really important with remote teams.
No, I agree. Well, Diana, this has been just so great talking with you. If there are people who are wanting to learn more about MMRF, maybe they're looking for a job to join your team, where can we direct people in our show notes to find out more about getting involved?
Absolutely. So our website is the MMRF.org, as in the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. And our handles on Facebook, Instagram, and X is @the MMRF. So we really encourage anyone to visit our website. You can learn all about our fundraising programs, our work in the research and education space, and of course, all about multiple myeloma, causes, risk factors, and all the resources you can think of, from building the right treatment plan to our, clinical studies and emerging therapies. It's just a really great place. So I would love for people to check out our website and get in touch. I'd love to hear from people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Diana.
Oh, this was great. Thank you so much, Marcie.
Absolutely.
The P2P Soap Box is produced in partnership with True Story FM. Engineering by Pete Wright. Music this week is by Super Nito. If your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, we hope you'll consider doing just that for our show. But the best thing you can do to support the P2P Soap Box is simply to share the show with a friend or colleague. Thank you for listening.